On January 5, 1943, at approximately 218 hours, the USS Helena navigated the waters near Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Russell Reid Cochrane manned the firing station of Mount 52, observing a Japanese Val dive bomber approaching through intermittent moonlight. As the aircraft drew closer, Cochrane steadied his hands on the controls, aware that his target was rapidly closing the distance approximately 2,800 yards away. Unbeknownst to him, the shells he was about to discharge contained an advanced technology so secret that even the gun mount captain had not received a full briefing on its operational capabilities. The order to fire crackled through his headset. The 5-inch gun erupted with thunder, launching its shell skyward at a velocity of 2,600 feet per second. Hidden within this shell was a compact radar mechanism, no larger than a light bulb, transmitting radio waves at a frequency of 180 MHz. The device constantly monitored for the reflected signals. When the returning signal indicated that the Val had entered a lethal proximity of about 70 feet, the fuse triggered automatically. The result was instantaneous. The enemy aircraft was obliterated 2,100 yards from the Helena, its remains scattered and burning, destroyed by a shell that never made physical contact. This engagement marked the first confirmed combat success using a proximity fuse, an achievement that would remain classified for the next 2 years. The shell's advanced technology, originally labeled VT for variable time to obscure its true function, would go on to revolutionize naval combat. By the conclusion of World War II, this integration of radar and explosives would neutralize thousands of kamikaze planes, turning Japan's last-ditch offensive strategy into a systematically defeated tactic. The underlying principle was a fusion of mathematics and technology, translated into vacuum tubes and radio signals. Within 2 years, proximity fuses would accomplish results that bravery and conventional weapons could not: the structured elimination of pilots intent on sacrificing themselves. Japan's kamikaze strategy arose from a stark mathematical reality that offered no favorable outcomes. By October 1944, following the catastrophic losses at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where American forces downed 645 Japanese planes while losing only 123, traditional bombing raids had become largely ineffective. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commanding Japan's first air fleet in the Philippines, confronted the cold arithmetic of defeat. With fewer than 100 serviceable aircraft against an American armada exceeding 700 ships, conventional strategies offered little hope. On October 19, 1944, at Guadalcanal Airfield, Onishi outlined his drastic solution to the officers of the 2001st Air Group. Captain Riki Inaguchi documented his words precisely. The nation's only possible salvation lay in the courage of young pilots willing to deliberately crash their aircraft into enemy carriers. The logic behind this extreme measure was clear. Standard bombing runs achieved success rates of less than 10% against moving warships. A plane piloted directly into a target could theoretically hit in about half of attempts. 1 aircraft, 1 pilot, potentially 1 enemy ship destroyed. Within Japan's desperate strategic calculations, this grim equation represented the only remaining avenue of hope. The inaugural coordinated kamikaze strike occurred on October 25, 1944. Lieutenant Yukioki commanded 50 aircraft from the Shimpu Special Attack Unit in an assault targeting American escort carriers near Samar. Each plane was armed with a 250-kilogram bomb, and the pilots carried personal mementos, poems for their families, and photographs of Emperor Hirohito, underscoring the intense personal commitment behind the mission. These attacks succeeded where conventional aerial operations had repeatedly failed, scoring direct hits on U.S. carriers. The USS Santee was struck, resulting in the deaths of 16 crew members, and just minutes later, the USS Suwannee also sustained a kamikaze impact. Commander David McSell, the Navy's top ace with 34 confirmed aerial victories, remarked in his action report, "This is a type of attack that cannot be entirely prevented. No level of pilot expertise ensures interception of every incoming plane. Our adversary has effectively turned death into a weapon." At that time, naval anti-aircraft defenses operated through three primary systems, each with inherent shortcomings that kamikaze pilots exploited ruthlessly. The outermost layer consisted of 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns, capable of engaging targets between approximately 10,000 and 18,000 yards. These weapons relied on shells equipped with mechanical time fuses, which had to be manually calibrated prior to firing. Fire control officers used the Mark 37 gunfire control system, an analog computer that predicted where a plane would be at the moment the shell reached it. Against a bomber traveling steadily at 200 miles per hour, the system worked reasonably well. However, against a kamikaze approaching at 400 m fire in a terminal dive while constantly maneuvering, the system's effectiveness collapsed. Gunner's mate First Class James Morrison of the USS Enterprise recounted the difficulty. "We'd calculate a solution for 4.5 seconds expecting the aircraft at 8,000 feet, but kamikaze pilots would change altitude or angle at the last second. By the time the shell exploded, the plane was often hundreds of feet off course. It felt like we were trying to solve geometry problems using only arithmetic." The secondary defense ring consisted of 40mm Bofors guns, positioned to engage targets between 4,000 and 6,000 yards. These fired contact-fused shells, which required a direct hit to damage a kamikaze, presenting a frontal area of less than 80 square feet while traveling 400 to 500 mv/8. Statistical analyses estimated the likelihood of a single round striking its target at less than 0.3%. Chief Petty Officer Harold Stassen, commanding a quadruple 40mm mount aboard the USS Hornet, recalled, "We could fire 480 rounds per minute, create traces all around the sky, and still watch kamikazes fly straight through. Even if we struck the plane, unless we destroyed the engine or killed the pilot instantly, the aircraft's momentum would carry it into the ship." The innermost layer of defense was composed of 20mm Oerlikon cannons, designed to engage planes within 2,000 yards. By the time a kamikaze reached this range, impact was typically imminent within 5 seconds. These small-caliber weapons required multiple hits to destroy an aircraft structurally. Seaman First Class Robert Baker, an Oerlikon gunner aboard the USS Missouri, described the experience. "At 2,000 yards, you had about 4 seconds to react. Your mind went blank. You just held the trigger and hoped. Even if you tore apart the wings, the fuselage often kept coming." The development of proximity fuses predated the kamikaze threat, originating during the 1940 Blitz over London. British anti-aircraft batteries at the time required roughly 18,500 shells to bring down a single bomber, a mathematically unsustainable figure. Shells had to be set for precise altitudes, but bombers were constantly changing elevation. An explosion occurring 100 feet from a target caused little harm, while one within 30 feet was usually lethal. In September 1940, Sir Henry Tizard arrived in Washington with some of Britain's most sensitive military innovations housed in a black metal deed box, offering them to the United States in exchange for the ability to produce them in mass quantities. Among these was a concept for miniaturized radar small enough to fit inside artillery shells. Responsibility for this project was assigned to Section T of the National Defense Research Committee, led by Dr. Merle Tuve at the institution that would become Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. The technical challenges were immense. Engineers had to design a device smaller than a coffee cup, capable of withstanding 20,000 times the force of gravity upon firing, sophisticated enough to distinguish aircraft from ground clutter, and cost-effective enough for large-scale deployment. The pivotal innovation came from physicist James Van Allen, who would later gain fame for discovering the belts of radiation encircling Earth. Van Allen suggested adapting vacuum tubes originally developed for hearing aids, the tiniest available at the time, because their compact construction gave them a chance to endure the extreme acceleration forces produced by artillery firing. These components, intended for amplification in earpieces for the hearing impaired, faced conditions that would obliterate standard electronic devices. By December 1942, Van Allen and his collaborators had successfully assembled a functional prototype. The resulting Mark 32 proximity fuse incorporated 5 vacuum tubes, a battery activated by the firing setback, a high-frequency oscillator operating at 180 MHz, and a thertron switch designed to initiate detonation once the strength of the reflected radio signal indicated a target had entered the effective blast radius. The complete assembly was roughly 3 inches in length and weighed about 11 ounces. Initial combat testing took place aboard USS Helena on January 5, 1943, though deployment across the Pacific Fleet was delayed due to stringent security concerns. The Navy feared that deploying the device over land could lead to its capture and reverse engineering by enemy forces. By October 1944, as Kamikaze attacks intensified, the United States had produced over 1 million of these fuses, each costing $18, a significant sum compared to conventional fuses, but negligible relative to the value of the ships they were intended to protect. Production plants in Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Bridgeport were churning out 40,000 fuses per day, relying largely on female laborers who were unaware of the exact nature of the items they were assembling. The fuses were shipped to Pacific bases in crates labeled as special ammunition handled with care, reflecting the extreme secrecy surrounding the technology. Even most naval gunnery officers received only basic operational guidance without being briefed on the underlying principles. Externally, the proximity-fused shells appeared identical to standard rounds, save for a small protective plastic nose cone covering the embedded radio antenna. The first significant shipment of 5-inch proximity-fused shells reached Battleship Division 7 in November 1944 under the command of Captain Willis Lee. His gunnery officer, Commander Edwin Hooper, later recalled that they had been told the shells could triple their effectiveness against aircraft. Initially skeptical, the officer's doubts vanished once the fuses demonstrated their capabilities in live conditions. The operation of the proximity fuse relied on elegantly simple physical principles. As a shell neared an aircraft, it transmitted radio waves that bounced back, increasing in intensity as the distance closed. When the returning signal indicated that the target was within a lethal radius roughly 70 feet for a 5-inch shell, the fuse triggered detonation. The explosion generated a sphere of high-velocity steel fragments, each capable of piercing aircraft aluminum from as far as 200 yards. What set this technology apart was its remarkable ability to discriminate between threats. Natural phenomena such as rain, clouds, and radar reflective chaff produced insufficient signal for detonation. Likewise, signals reflected from the ground were filtered out via the Doppler effect, the same principle that causes a passing train's whistle to change pitch. Only the rapid closure of a moving aircraft provided the precise conditions necessary to activate the fuse. The invasion of Okinawa, beginning on April 1, 1945, served as the ultimate test for the proximity fuse under intense kamikaze assault. The Japanese launched the Kikusui operations, massive coordinated strikes involving floating airwaves resembling chrysanthemums. Over 3 months, nearly 1,900 kamikaze sorties were carried out in waves, for the first time the majority of U.S. ships were equipped with proximity-fused ammunition across all calibers from 5-inch shells down to 40mm rounds. The first wave of the Kikusui attacks on April 6, 1945 coincided with the fateful sortie of the battleship Yamato in Operation Ten-Go. Kikusui involved 355 kamikaze aircraft accompanied by 344 conventional fighters. Radar operators aboard USS El Dorado reported seeing what they described as a snowstorm. So many aircraft appeared on the screens that individual blips merged into a solid mass. Fire Controlman Second Class Eugene Hardy, serving aboard the destroyer USS Newcomb, recounted the relentless assaults they endured. Attacks came in successive waves with little pause. Their 5-inch guns began engaging targets at a distance of 12,000 yards. Observers could make out distant black explosions and aircraft plummeting not in controlled dives, but in shattered, tumbling falls. The introduction of proximity fuses transformed near misses into confirmed hits. The experience of the USS Laffey on April 16 exemplified this dramatic effect. Positioned at Radar Picket Station No. 1, Laffey confronted a swarm of 22 kamikaze planes over the span of just 80 minutes. The crew discharged 637 rounds of 5-inch shells equipped with proximity fuses. Despite enduring impacts from 6 kamikaze strikes and 4 conventional bombs, the ship remained afloat. The gunners successfully neutralized at least 9 attackers. Survivors described the effect of these fuses as forming an almost tangible barrier of steel around the vessel. Commander Frederick Beckton, Laffey's commanding officer, emphasized, "The proximity fuses were the reason we survived. When a kamikaze approached, our guns fired, and the plane would simply vanish broken apart midair. Our defensive fire became reliably lethal." Data collected during the Okinawa campaign highlighted the revolutionary impact of this technology. Ships equipped with proximity-fused ammunition destroyed kamikaze aircraft at rates approximately 7 times greater than those relying on conventional shells. This improvement directly correlated with fewer casualties and more ships surviving attacks. Japanese pilots quickly noticed a radical shift in American anti-aircraft effectiveness, although the precise mechanism remained a mystery to them. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Minobu, who escorted kamikaze missions, later testified that by late 1944, American gunners exhibited seemingly supernatural precision. Aircraft would explode without any direct hits, prompting speculation among Japanese aviators that the Americans had deployed invisible wires, aerial mines, or other extraordinary devices. Captured Japanese records confirm the confusion. A tactical bulletin from the 2001 Air Group dated December 1944 observed, "Enemy anti-aircraft efficiency has surged dramatically. Shells appear to detonate at a distance rather than upon impact, recommend irregular flight paths and extreme dive maneuvers." In their attempts to counteract these new defenses, Japanese forces proposed a range of theories: magnetic fuses attracted to engines, infrared sensors detecting heat, even psychic influence to trigger detonations. They resorted to asbestos shielding, degoring coils, and constructing wooden aircraft, yet all measures proved futile against radar-based proximity fuses. Toshio Yoshitake, captured after his aircraft suffered damage from fuse fragments, described the experience to interrogators. "We were told American gunners were unskilled and relied solely on volume. But their shells seemed to anticipate our location, exploding around us and forming walls of metal. Flying through American fire felt like passing through a storm of steel." The proximity fuse represented a remarkable feat of miniaturization and industrial production. The Mark 53 fuse, the most widely deployed model by 1945, contained 134 electronic components, all assembled with microscopic precision. Each device had to endure forces equivalent to 20,000 times gravity when fired, spin at 30,000 revolutions per minute during flight, and operate in extreme temperatures ranging from -40 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Manufacturing techniques pushed the boundaries of the era. Assemblers used jeweler's magnifying lenses to solder connections smaller than grains of rice. Quality assurance protocols required testing 1 out of every 500 fuses through actual firing. Early rejection rates exceeded 60%, though improvements reduced this to less than 8% by 1945. Even the battery system was a breakthrough. A glass ampule containing electrolyte shattered during firing to activate a wet cell that powered the fuse for its entire flight, allowing long-term storage without loss of function. Western electric engineers developed unique winding methods for vacuum tubes, using microscopic springs to absorb acceleration forces that would otherwise destroy standard tubes. Similar innovations allowed hearing aid tubes to survive extreme conditions, enabling the proximity fuse to operate reliably under combat stresses. The introduction of proximity fuses not only enhanced anti-aircraft accuracy but fundamentally changed naval defensive doctrine. Prior to their use, ships relied on extensive barrage fire, saturating the air with shells in the hope that enemy aircraft would fly into them. This approach consumed vast amounts of ammunition yet offered low probability of success. The advent of proximity fuses converted anti-aircraft operations from a hopeful gamble into a precise and lethal system, reshaping naval warfare in the Pacific. Commander Joseph Callahan, serving as the tactical officer for Task Force 58, described the transformative impact of the proximity fuse on naval artillery. With traditional time-fused shells, our goal was to strike a precise point in space at an exact moment, he noted. This was extremely challenging against fast-moving targets. The introduction of proximity fuses simplified the task dramatically. As long as the shell came close enough, the fuse would trigger detonation automatically. This technological advance allowed ships to adopt entirely new firing tactics. Instead of concentrating massive volleys on a single target, naval crews could now engage multiple threats simultaneously with smaller salvos. For instance, a destroyer that once required 50 rounds to achieve a reasonable chance of hitting a single aircraft could now target 3 planes with the same number of shells. The proximity fuse also revolutionized nighttime defense. Commander Callahan emphasized that darkness had previously rendered time fuses nearly useless, since estimating range under low visibility was almost impossible. Proximity fuses bypassed this limitation, allowing shells to determine their own detonation point independent of human sight. Lieutenant Commander Roger Bond, who served as the gunnery officer aboard the USS Enterprise, highlighted the dramatic improvement in night combat. Kamikaze attacks at night had long been our greatest challenge, he explained. We would fire thousands of rounds with minimal effect. After introducing proximity fuses, our hit rate at night soared from roughly 10% to over 70%. By mid-1945, Japanese forces largely ceased nighttime assaults. By the conclusion of the war, American industry had produced over 22 million proximity fuses, effectively 1 for every 6 Japanese citizens. The program was an immense industrial and logistical undertaking, employing workers across 87 companies operating more than 100 facilities, all secured with precautions comparable to the Manhattan Project. The Crossley Corporation in Cincinnati emerged as the largest production hub, assembling up to 16,500 fuses per day at the height of manufacturing. Workers operated under stringent security protocols, entry through guarded gates, surrendering personal belongings, and assembling components in windowless rooms with parts labeled only by coded numbers. Quality assurance for the fuses reached unprecedented levels. Each batch underwent rigorous testing, with 1 out of every 1,000 fuses test fired at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Any unit failing to detonate within the specified range triggered rejection of the entire batch. This meticulous attention to reliability ensured combat performance exceeding 95%. Proximity fuses were resource-intensive, consuming notable quantities of strategic metals such as silver, gold, and platinum for electrical contacts. By 1945, monthly silver usage for proximity fuses surpassed the entire pre-war annual consumption of the American jewelry industry. Both Axis powers recognized the immense significance of the technology, sparking intense intelligence efforts. Germany, having captured fuses from encounters with Von flying bombs over England, sought desperately to devise countermeasures. Japan, with no intact examples in hand, attempted to reconstruct the concept from fragments and battlefield observations. American intelligence implemented extraordinary protective measures. Initially, proximity-fused shells were restricted to use over water to prevent enemy capture. The policy became critically tested in late 1944, when the USS Drexler sank at Okinawa, carrying magazines full of proximity-fused shells. Navy officials debated a hazardous salvage operation to ensure no materials were recovered. Commander Joseph Rashford, head of Pacific Fleet Intelligence, coordinated elaborate deception campaigns to mask the true source of the naval success. False information suggested that improvements were the result of advanced crew training or new optical range-finding devices. Captured German agents were deliberately misled into believing the US relied on magnetic anomaly fuses that detected distortions in the Earth's magnetic field. Meanwhile, Japanese forces never secured a fully functional proximity fuse. Their most detailed intelligence came from interrogating captured B-29 crew members, who possessed only limited knowledge of the technology. This led Japanese scientists to pursue ineffective projects such as radio-guided shells. Throughout 1945, the U.S. Navy's Operational Research Group conducted meticulous analyses of the fuse's combat effectiveness, confirming the decisive advantage they conferred. The The proximity fuse had, in a remarkably short period, transformed naval warfare, increasing accuracy, enabling multiple target engagement, providing the first reliable nighttime defense, and shaping industrial, intelligence, and tactical strategies on a global scale. Analysis of records up to 1958 clearly demonstrated the decisive effect of proximity fuses on anti-aircraft effectiveness. Before the widespread introduction of this technology from October 1944 through January 1945, kamikaze attacks achieved a strike rate of 28.7%, counting both direct hits and near misses that inflicted damage. On average, naval vessels expended approximately 312 rounds for each aircraft destroyed. Destroyer picket ships faced significant risk, losing or sustaining heavy damage on roughly 1 out of every 15 kamikaze missions. Following the deployment of proximity fuses between February and August 1945, the success rate of kamikaze attacks dropped dramatically, falling to below 10%. At the same time, the efficiency of anti-aircraft fire improved significantly, with only 89 rounds needed per aircraft destroyed, a 71% improvement in ammunition usage. Destroyer losses decreased sharply to 1 vessel per 47 kamikaze sorties, even though Japanese pilots had begun employing more aggressive attack tactics. Detailed assessments revealed important tactical subtleties. Proximity fuses were particularly effective against steep diving attacks, the method most favored by kamikaze pilots, achieving over 85% success against dives steeper than 45 degrees. Effectiveness against low-altitude approaches was reduced but still surpassed conventional shells. Captain Willis Lee's action report from April 1945 provides a concrete illustration. On April 16, 1945, a naval force engaged 43 incoming aircraft. Proximity-fused 5-inch shells accounted for 31 confirmed kills at ranges between 4,000 and 9,000 yards, whereas conventional ammunition fired concurrently produced only 3 kills despite using 40% more shells. Not all ships initially mastered the operational use of proximity fuses. The technology demanded new training, refined tactics, and specific maintenance protocols. The experience of USS Newcomb highlighted the learning curve. The crew initially set the radar-controlled guns for maximum continuous fire, which caused interference among multiple fuses and actually reduced their effectiveness. As a result, 5 kamikaze aircraft penetrated their defenses on April 6, 1945, inflicting severe damage. Lieutenant Commander Irving McPherson, the ship's gunnery officer, noted that simultaneous firing caused fuses to disrupt one another due to overlapping radio signals, producing false radar returns. The Navy quickly adapted, developing new operational doctrines. Certain gun mounts were dedicated exclusively to proximity-fused shells, while others continued to use conventional rounds. Fire control teams implemented rhythmic firing patterns and timed bursts to minimize interference and maximize coverage. Maintenance was equally critical, as the electronic components were highly sensitive to humidity, salt, and temperature fluctuations. Vessels operating in tropical climates observed frequent fuse failures when stored in uncooled magazines, prompting the installation of dehumidifiers and climate-controlled storage spaces. The scale of the proximity fuse program was staggering. From January 1943 to August 1945, a total of 2,273,481 fuses were manufactured across 110 facilities in 26 states. At peak production, 75,000 fuses of all types were produced daily, including 40,000 specifically for anti-aircraft use. The program required substantial resources, consuming 12 tons of silver and $800 worth of gold each month, as well as 15,000 meters of wire and 140 million vacuum tubes over the course of production. Performance metrics were impressive. Combat reliability was 95 3%, premature detonation occurred in only 0.3% of cases, dud rates stood at 4.4%, and storage stability after 1 year reached 99.27%. Japanese records captured after the war also provide insight into the psychological impact of proximity fuses on kamikaze pilots. The 721st Naval Air Group's diary, recovered from Kanoya Air Base, documents a progressive decline in morale throughout 1945. In January, entries noted that enemy shells were detonating by proximity rather than timers, advising pilots to maintain a minimum altitude until the final attack run. By March, losses before reaching targets exceeded 60%, and the steel barrier created by defensive fire had begun to intimidate pilots. In May, reports described attacks against impenetrable walls of anti-aircraft fire, with conventional evasive maneuvers proving ineffective, prompting requests for night operations only. By July 1945, the diary reflected a heightened sense of desperation among crews facing the near inescapable reach of proximity fuse defenses. In summary, the introduction of proximity fuses during World War II transformed naval anti-aircraft defense, dramatically increasing ammunition efficiency, reducing ship losses, and undermining the effectiveness and morale of kamikaze forces. The technology required both tactical adaptation and rigorous maintenance, but its impact on the final months of the Pacific Campaign was decisive. Daily alcohol allowances were quietly raised as morale faltered. At the same time, an increasing number of volunteers began requesting standard combat assignments, even though such missions carried far less symbolic honor. Rumors spread among aircrews that enemy fire no longer behaved according to ordinary physics, as if guided by unseen forces. Lieutenant Koshi Ogawa would later speak of this after the war. He was among the rare kamikaze pilots who survived multiple sorties, not through skill or mercy, but because repeated mechanical malfunctions prevented his aircraft from reaching its target. According to Ogawa, the pilots departed believing their deaths would be heroic offerings to the emperor. What they witnessed instead was far more unsettling: aircraft detonating harmlessly in the sky, far from American ships, their pilots dying without effect. To those who survived, it no longer resembled combat. It felt like a systematic elimination. Behind this shift in battlefield reality stood a technological development of extraordinary sophistication, the Mark 53 proximity fuse. By 1945, it had become standard equipment aboard American naval vessels. Though small in size, measuring roughly 3.2 inches in length, 2.1 inches in diameter, and weighing just over 11 ounces, it was a masterpiece of compact engineering. Inside were 134 precisely manufactured components, including a fully self-contained electronic system. At its core, the fuse operated using radio frequency technology. Its oscillator functioned within a range of approximately 180 to 220 MHz, transmitting a signal at about 0.4 watts of power. Depending on configuration, it could detect targets at distances between 15 and 70 feet. Once activated, its internal battery, designed to remain inert until firing, provided energy for roughly 20 to 30 seconds, enough time to complete its mission. The electronic signal passed through a 4-stage amplification process, allowing the device to interpret faint reflections with remarkable accuracy. The fuse was engineered to endure extreme physical stress, a firing setback force of 20,000 G, rotational speeds up to 30,000 revolutions per minute, temperatures ranging from 65 to plus 165 degrees Fahrenheit, and humidity levels approaching saturation. It could also withstand lateral shocks of 500 G without failure. Despite this complexity, the operational logic was deceptively simple. When the shell was fired, the sudden acceleration shattered a sealed electrolyte vial, activating the battery. As the shell spun through the air, centrifugal force armed the detonator after a brief delay of approximately 0.8 seconds. The oscillator continuously transmitted radio waves while the receiver monitored for reflected signals. When the returning signal indicated that a target had entered the lethal radius, a thyrotron switch instantly released the firing capacitor. From detection to explosion, the entire process took only a fraction of a millisecond, approximately 3/10,000ths of a second. Admiral Richmond Turner, who commanded U.S. amphibious forces during the Okinawa campaign, later stated that without proximity fuses, the invasion might not have succeeded. He estimated that American losses could have surpassed 150 sunk ships. In his view, the technology directly enabled victory by drastically reducing those losses and preserving tens of thousands of lives. Japanese leadership took notice. Although Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast famously referenced the devastating power of atomic weapons, internal military documents reveal an equally profound alarm over improvements in conventional American defenses. A classified Imperial Navy analysis completed in July 1945 concluded that enemy anti-aircraft systems had advanced to a point where special attack operations no longer produced acceptable results. This assessment was reinforced by post-war interviews conducted during the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. Admiral Somu Toyoda, then Chief of the Naval General Staff, explained that Japanese planners originally calculated that 500 suicide aircraft could destroy roughly 10 American ships during the Okinawa battle. In practice, those same 500 aircraft resulted in fewer than 30 ships being seriously damaged. The disparity made further operations statistically futile. According to Toyoda, once this reality became clear, continuation was no longer mathematically defensible. From an economic and logistical perspective, the proximity fuse program proved astonishingly efficient. The total development and production cost reached approximately $1.2 billion. In return, analysts estimated that more than 200 major ships were spared destruction, representing replacement costs exceeding $8 billion. The number of American lives preserved was conservatively placed between 40,000 and 60,000, not including long-term medical and disability expenses, another $2 billion effectively avoided. Operational advantages extended well beyond survivability. Ammunition consumption dropped by roughly 70%, required magazine storage space decreased by 60%. Gun crew fatigue was cut in half, while the time needed to neutralize each aerial target fell by nearly 2/3. In simple financial terms, a proximity fuse cost about $18, and a standard 5-inch shell cost around $12. Together, the $30 investment was routinely used to destroy aircraft valued at approximately $15,000, an exchange ratio exceeding 500 to 1. By mid-1945, the effectiveness of these fuses had reshaped Japanese operational planning entirely. Operation Ketsugo, the final defense strategy for the Japanese home islands, abandoned large-scale daylight kamikaze assaults altogether. Instead, it emphasized nighttime operations, ultra-low altitude approaches, and reliance on poor weather to negate American detection and fire control advantages. Vice Admiral Matomi Ugaki, commander of Japan's Special Attack Forces, recorded his frustration in his diary on July 24, 1945, a quiet acknowledgement that technology, not courage, had finally tipped the balance beyond recovery. American forces encountered a defensive system that proved nearly impenetrable. Young servicemen lost their lives with little effect, often detonating far from any intended target. Commanders recognized that continuing current tactics would be futile without developing alternative approaches or abandoning specialized assault methods entirely. In parallel, Japanese strategists conceived Operation Tsurugi, a plan for suicide missions in which aircraft, stripped of non-essential equipment, would skim just above the ocean's surface to evade radar. Pilots would ascend only in the final moments before striking. Trials suggested potential effectiveness, but Japan's surrender occurred before these operations could be fully deployed. Japanese researchers also pursued countermeasures against electronic detection. Project Yashima aimed to create jamming devices capable of interfering with proximity fuses. Laboratory experiments yielded promising results, but industrial limitations prevented mass production. Even the most advanced prototype weighed over 200 pounds and required a dedicated aircraft for deployment, undermining the operational concept. Meanwhile, the success of proximity fuses in Allied hands triggered rapid adaptation across multiple fronts. British anti-aircraft units, employing ground-based guns equipped with these fuses, were able to destroy roughly 79% of V-1 flying bombs targeting London after December 1944. The Soviets, under the Lend-Lease program, received 25,000 proximity fuses, achieving comparable results against enemy air assaults on cities along the Eastern Front. These outcomes accelerated innovations in military ordnance technology. By the conclusion of the war, American engineers had adapted proximity fuses for use in a wide range of weapons: aerial and naval rockets, artillery shells, mortar rounds, and bombs dropped from aircraft. Each platform required tailored modifications. Rockets had to handle higher velocities, artillery fuses incorporated ground return filters, and bombs relied on barometric switches to prevent premature detonation at altitude. Unbeknownst to the Allies, Germany had independently developed its own proximity fuse technology, highlighting the distinction between theoretical invention and mass production capability. The German Krennic fuse utilized capacitive sensing to detect changes in an aircraft's electrical field. Its design, with only 23 components compared to the American version's 134, was more streamlined but could not be produced at scale with available German manufacturing methods. Germany ultimately produced only 8,000 units, while American output reached 22 million. In reflecting on this after the war, Dr. Hubert Schadin, the lead German scientist, noted, "We had solved the theoretical problem as early as 1940, yet without the industrial capacity to produce it, theory remained only academically interesting. Americans could manufacture in one day what would take us a month." Proximity fuses played a critical role in reducing casualties during preparations for the planned invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, set for November 1945. Japanese suicide attacks were expected to deploy 5,000 to 10,000 aircraft against the invasion fleet. Before the introduction of proximity fuses, predictions indicated the potential loss of 400,500 ships and as many as 100,000 naval personnel. With proximity-fused ammunition, these numbers were recalculated to 100,150 ships and approximately 25,000 casualties, still substantial but within operational tolerances. The subsequent use of atomic bombs rendered these projections moot, though the battle experience at Okinawa suggested even the reduced figures might have been optimistic. Individual incidents vividly illustrate the technology's life-saving impact. On May 3, 1945, the USS Aaron Ward faced multiple kamikaze attacks. Using proximity-fused shells, the crew successfully shot down 6 enemy aircraft, though 3 kamikazes still managed to strike the ship. Later analyses suggested that without the proximity fuses, most attacking planes would have hit their targets, likely sinking the vessel and causing massive loss of life. Similarly, gunner's mate Aristides Foutridis, who commanded Mount 52 aboard USS Laffey during intense kamikaze assaults, later employed computer simulations in the 1970 seconds. These calculations indicated that conventional ammunition would have allowed 14 kamikazes to hit, a scenario in which survival was improbable. The lives of all aboard were directly attributable to the effectiveness of proximity-fused ordnance. Fire controlman Lawrence Dowski recalled the impact of the proximity fuse on naval combat. "Before we had VT fuses, radar would alert us to dozens of incoming enemy aircraft, but we knew many would inevitably penetrate our defenses. Once proximity fuses were deployed, that uncertainty vanished. For the first time, technology seemed to work decisively in our favor." The development of the proximity fuse not only transformed wartime operations but also accelerated numerous technological domains. The extreme miniaturization requirements forced innovations that later contributed directly to transistor technology. Manufacturing techniques designed for mass production foreshadowed the approaches now standard in modern electronics. Stringent quality control procedures introduced during the program created benchmarks that the aerospace industry still references today. Dr. James Van Allen reflected in 1980 on the scope of the program, calling it the Manhattan Project for Electronics. In just 2 years, the proximity fuse program compressed what would have been 2 decades of technological progress. Every modern electronic device, cell phones, computers, and countless other systems traces some aspect of its manufacturing heritage back to these innovations. The program generated 87 patents, established 12 new industrial processes, and trained thousands of technicians in precision electronics. After the war, these skilled workers became the foundation of America's burgeoning electronics sector, giving rise to companies such as Texas Instruments, Fairchild Semiconductor, and Intel. Japanese post-war assessments published in the 1952 series by the Defense Agency highlighted how proximity fuses had fundamentally shifted the calculus of special attack missions. By March 1945, these operations had become largely ineffective due to the new anti-aircraft technology. Captain Rikihei Inaguchi, who served as a senior officer in the Kamikaze operations, later wrote in 1958 that the fuse represented not just a technical improvement, but a complete conceptual transformation. Anti-aircraft fire moved from being a matter of chance to a nearly predictable threat. Our pilots confronted organized destruction rather than random peril. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the architect of Japan's Kamikaze program, ultimately took his own life on August 16, 1945. His farewell note included an apology to the families of the pilots he had sent to certain death. Historians have linked the growing effectiveness of proximity fuses to his despair. Throughout 1945, U.S. engineers continued refining the fuses based on combat experience. The Mark 58, introduced in May, integrated lessons from the Battle of Okinawa, including circuits that reduced premature detonations in cloud formations by 90%, adjustable sensitivity for different targets, improved counter-jamming capabilities, extended battery life up to 35 seconds, and weight reductions to under 10 ounces. The subsequent Mark 59, completed as Japan surrendered, would have further enhanced reliability to 99.2% using microalloy vacuum tubes while lowering production costs to $11 per unit. The Proximity Fuse initiative exemplified the flexibility of American industry. Factories that had never produced electronics transformed almost overnight into high-precision manufacturing facilities. Zenith Radio Corporation, for example, retooled its Chicago plant from consumer radios to combat-grade fuses in a mere 6 weeks. Collaboration between competing firms was unprecedented. RCA, Westinghouse, General Electric, and Sylvania openly shared patents, techniques, and weekly bulletins, a level of cooperation unimaginable in peacetime. The statistical impact of proximity fuses during the Pacific War was significant. A total of 2,273,481 fuses were manufactured, with 5.3 million expended in combat. Their effectiveness was 7 times higher than conventional fuses, resulting in a 70% reduction in ammunition usage, countless lives saved, and major protection for naval vessels. Estimates suggest 40,000 to 6,000 American servicemen survived due to these fuses, along with over 200 major warships and more than 500 smaller ships. Japanese losses attributed to proximity fuses included at least 2,800 aircraft destroyed and over 4,200 pilots killed, while Kamikaze's strike effectiveness dropped from 28.7% to under 10%. Economically, the program's $1.2 billion investment returned more than $10 billion in avoided losses, an extraordinary 8.3 to 1 return. Admiral Mark Mitchell, commanding Task Force 58, submitted the final action report on August 20, 1945, affirming the decisive contribution of proximity fuses to Allied success. The development of the proximity fuse proved pivotal in countering Japan's special attack strategies during World War II. In its absence, Allied losses would likely have reached unsustainable levels, but with it, the kamikaze threat was transformed from a seemingly unstoppable assault into a manageable challenge, allowing USR forces to wear down the enemy systematically. By the war's final weeks, Japanese kamikaze operations were largely ineffective, achieving a mere 28% success rate. Statistically, 97 out of every 100 pilots failed to reach their intended targets, illustrating the dramatic impact of this technological advancement. The proximity fuse did more than simply shoot down individual aircraft, it fundamentally undermined an entire military doctrine. The Japanese strategy relied on the belief that sheer spiritual commitment and willingness to sacrifice could counterbalance technological and material disadvantages. The proximity fuse demonstrated that intelligently applied technology could neutralize even the most fanatical forms of warfare, proving that dedication alone could not overcome superior firepower. Several key lessons from the fuse continue to shape modern military technology. First, miniaturization amplifies effectiveness. Integrating radar components into artillery shells showcased how shrinking technology could dramatically increase battlefield impact. Every contemporary guided or smart munition owes a conceptual debt to this principle. Second, mass production determines outcomes in war. Germany's technological innovations were impressive, yet without the industrial capacity to produce them in quantity, they had little practical effect. The United States' ability to manufacture millions of proximity fuses was a decisive factor in its success. The fuse also illustrated the power of integration over pure innovation. While it did not rely on groundbreaking new inventions, it brought together existing technologies in a remarkably efficient and effective system. Modern military doctrine often mirrors this approach, prioritizing the coordination of systems over the creation of entirely novel components. Automation played a crucial role as well. By removing split-second decision-making from humans and entrusting it to the device itself, the proximity fuse both saved lives and improved operational performance, a principle echoed in today's automated defense networks. Despite the dramatic conclusion of World War II with the atomic bomb, proximity fuses had already laid the groundwork for a feasible invasion of Japan by eliminating the kamikaze threat. Without this technological advantage, anticipated American casualties might have reached politically unacceptable levels. Beyond the statistics were individual lives: young Americans who survived because shells detonated at precisely the right moment, and young Japanese pilots who perished before achieving their intended impact. The fuse shifted the Pacific Theater's final phase from a potentially catastrophic bloodbath into a scenario dominated by technological superiority. The proximity fuse symbolized more than a weapon. It was the tangible expression of American scientific and industrial dominance. It demonstrated that no degree of courage, self-sacrifice, or ideological commitment could negate the advantages of a fully mobilized, technologically advanced democracy. The kamikaze pilots offered their lives, but the fuse rendered their efforts strategically irrelevant. Sailors witnessed enemy planes disintegrating in midair. Factory workers contributed components without fully understanding their use, and scientists solved complex technical challenges, all components of a collective effort to counter fanaticism with innovation and organization. The mass deployment of 22 million proximity fuses sent a clear message. American technology could safeguard lives regardless of the risks enemies were willing to impose. In achieving this, the fuse did far more than neutralize aircraft. It invalidated the fundamental premise behind kamikaze tactics, proving that spiritual determination alone could not overcome material and technological superiority. By the war's end, the proximity fuse had not only changed the outcome of battles but also reshaped the strategic understanding of what technology could accomplish in modern warfare. American radar technology, miniaturized and produced in staggering quantities, rendered the kamikaze attacks largely ineffective, reducing them to a historical curiosity rather than a strategic threat. Japan's military ambitions, symbolized by the rising sun, were extinguished not by sheer force of arms but by the invisible waves and tiny vacuum tubes that Americans had perfected, components no larger than a small cup. The bitter irony of history was evident. Japan had struck Pearl Harbor to deter American interference in its imperial expansion, yet it was the very ingenuity of American science that neutralized its most devoted pilots. Their deliberate sacrifices, intended to inflict devastating damage, were transformed into futile acts by technology operating silently and invisibly in the sky. Central to this transformation was the radar-guided proximity fuse, a device that redefined the meaning of combat effectiveness. Rather than matching courage with courage or sacrifice with sacrifice, this innovation rendered selfless acts meaningless, protecting lives while undermining fanaticism. Its success depended not on individual heroism or sheer destruction, but on the systematic application of superior design, mass production, and precise engineering. The fuse turned Japan's ultimate offensive strategy into an exercise in futility, and in doing so, marked a decisive point in the Pacific War. Through this lens, the conflict's conclusion demonstrates a fundamental shift in how victory was achieved. It was measured in circuitry and electronics rather than valor, in scientific insight rather than martyrdom, and in preventive technology rather than in human loss. The kamikaze pilots, prepared to die with intent and honor, instead found their actions neutralized before reaching their targets. This outcome not only sealed Imperial Japan's defeat but also highlighted a defining feature of American military power: the ability to secure dominance through innovation, production, and technological foresight. The radar proximity fuse exemplified a new paradigm where modern warfare rewarded ingenuity over self-sacrifice and life-preserving precision over glorified destruction.